We convene today not to debate the outdatedness of our RF safety guidelines, nor to lament the unintended consequences of a misguided telecommunications policy. No, our purpose is far more dire: to expose and dismantle one of the most calculated, premeditated acts of regulatory fraud and constitutional sabotage in modern history. The Federal Communications Commission's RF exposure guidelines were not outdated. They were fraudulent from their inception. The passage of Section 704 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was not an unfortunate oversight. It was an engineered corporate coup designed to shield the telecom industry from liability, silence communities, and override constitutional checks and balances. This was not regulatory inertia. This was a systemic deception orchestrated with surgical precision, one that must now be reversed, not merely for the sake of policy correction, but as an imperative of scientific integrity, constitutional restoration, and intergenerational justice. The FCC's RF Safety Guidelines, a preordained fraud, not an oversight, the intentional rejection of overwhelming scientific evidence. The telecom industry and the government agencies it infiltrated knew beyond any doubt that thermal-only RF guidelines were scientifically indefensible. The decision to ignore non-thermal biological effects was not the result of insufficient data, but the willful suppression of evidence spanning decades. Consider the timeline. 1950s Soviet research Russian scientists documented neurological, immune, and cardiovascular effects from low-level RF exposure, leading to safety limits orders of magnitude lower than U.S. standards. 1960s Robert Becker's research established that electromagnetic fields, EMFs, influence wound healing, nerve regeneration, and cellular function, proving biological interaction at non-thermal levels. 1976 Naval Medical Research Institute report. A declassified U.S. military review citing over 2,300 studies detailing non-thermal RF effects on brain function, fertility, and immune response. 1984. Air Force studies U.S. military research confirming DNA strand breaks from RF exposure at levels far below heating thresholds. 1994 Industry-funded wargaming memo. A telecommunications industry document outlining strategic plans to discredit and suppress scientists who found non-thermal effects. 1996 FCC guidelines formalized. Despite decades of compelling evidence, the FCC codified thermal-only guidelines, directly benefiting telecom expansion while ignoring proven biological risks. Let there be no mistake, this was not scientific ignorance. It was deliberate deception. The telecom industry's own studies confirmed harm, then were buried. Even when telecom-funded research confirmed non-thermal biological effects, the findings were suppressed or discredited. 1999-2018 National Toxicology Program, NTP, study. This $30 million government study found clear evidence that RF exposure causes brain and heart tumors, yet rather than initiating a regulatory overhaul, the government defunded further NTP research. Ramazzini Institute study confirmed the NTP's findings at exposure levels 60 times lower, yet industry and regulators dismissed it outright. Motorola's own study's internal research in the 1990s found RF exposure caused DNA damage and cellular stress. Instead of acting on these findings, Motorola executives ordered the study buried. Air Force-funded studies on neurological damage. These military-backed studies in the 1980s demonstrated clear neurophysiological alterations from non-thermal RF exposure. Rather than addressing the implications, the findings were classified, and military personnel were kept in harm's way. Thus, the FCC guidelines were not a failure to update regulations in light of new findings. They were a premeditated fraud from inception, written to ensure scientific truth was never allowed to interfere with industry profit. Section 704 of the Telecommunications Act, a constitutional crime, not an unintended consequence. Section 704, the legislative mechanism for suppressing truth. Had communities been free to challenge RF tower placements on health grounds, industry executives knew they would face lawsuits, moratoriums, and insurmountable liability. So, they ensured this avenue of resistance was eliminated in advance. The result was Section 704, a legislative provision that prohibits municipalities from blocking wireless infrastructure due to health concerns, effectively silencing parents, schools, and entire cities from questioning cell tower placements. This is not regulation, it is authoritarian corporate protectionism enshrined in federal law. Preempts state and local governments, denies communities their constitutional right to regulate infrastructure placement in their own jurisdictions, voids parental rights, prevents parents from using peer-reviewed science to challenge the placement of towers near schools, legally shields industry from health-based challenges. If RF exposure standards were ever acknowledged as harmful, telecom companies would face trillions in liability. Section 704 ensures that legal doors remain shut regardless of what science reveals. This was not overzealous deregulation. It was a preemptive strike against democratic accountability. The path forward: undoing the 1996 trifecta of deception. The solution is clear: dismantle the fraudulent framework that was deliberately constructed to suppress health science and override constitutional rights. Repeal Section 704, restore local authority over wireless infrastructure, return power to communities, allowing municipalities to reject wireless infrastructure based on public health risks, reinstate First and 10th Amendment protections, ensuring parents, schools, and cities can invoke science in public hearings. Enforce Public Law 9602, hold regulators accountable to scientific integrity, mandate that RF exposure guidelines be reviewed biennially based on emerging research, restore NTP and EPA research funding to conduct longitudinal studies on non-thermal RF exposure effects, legally require full disclosure of industry-funded research findings. Overhaul FCC guidelines, replace fraudulent thermal standards with biologically based limits. Base exposure limits on independent biomedical research rather than industry-funded engineering models. Adopt non-thermal safety thresholds that recognize DNA damage, oxidative stress, and neurological impacts. Set protective guidelines for children, acknowledging that developing bodies are uniquely vulnerable. Foster safer, non-toxic wireless alternatives. Transition to space-based broadband. Relocating high-powered RF transmissions to orbit ensures exposure remains well below ground-level intensities. Expand Li-Fi and fiber optic infrastructure. Light-based data transmission eliminates chronic microwave exposure indoors. Mandate RF-free zones for schools and residential areas, recognizing that the precautionary principle must govern exposure for vulnerable populations. The moral and historical imperative to act now. This is not merely a debate about wireless policy. It is a battle for scientific integrity, constitutional governance, and the health of future generations. Every child who sits in a classroom beneath a cell tower, every family living in the shadow of a high-powered transmitter, every scientist whose findings were buried to protect industry profit, they are the casualties of a deliberate and systemic fraud that has persisted unchecked for nearly 3 decades. We cannot merely update safety guidelines. We must overhaul the entire system of deception that was erected in 1996 to shield the telecom industry from accountability. The time for half measures is over. The time for action is now. Repeal Section 704 and restore constitutional authority over wireless infrastructure. Enforce Public Law 90-602 and demand transparency in regulatory oversight. Replace the fraudulent FCC guidelines with legitimate, biologically based exposure standards. Transition to space-based broadband and photonic communication, ensuring that connectivity and biological safety are no longer in conflict. This is not merely an opportunity for reform. It is an obligation to rectify one of the greatest scientific and legislative frauds in modern history. History will record whether we mustered the intellectual courage and political will to dismantle the House of Lies built in 1996. The choice is ours. #Trump repeal 704 #enforce public law 90,602. Visit RF Safe to learn more.